Hello, welcome everyone. Bonjour et bienvenue. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Tom Vargas. I am New Power Labs research lead. And joining me with today is my colleague Bamboo Ren, a research associate. For those of you who are joining us for the first time or are less familiar with our work, NPL is, or New Power Labs is a think tank, think and do tank, we like to think of ourselves, that focuses on moving capital and shifting power to underfunded and overlooked communities. Our work spans across the diversity of Canada, across gender, ethnicity, abilities, sexual orientation, citizenship status, what have you. We work in partnership with those who deploy capital, from philanthropy to impact investing to VC to traditional finance. So we like to think about ourselves as engaging the full spectrum of capital. And we do this with the work of a growing group of core partners, which we are incredibly grateful for, including Duca Impact Lab, World Education Services, Coast Capital, OTF, and Community Foundations of Canada. Inspire Foundation, Vancouver Foundation, and most recently, Jumpstart. Part of the work that we're doing today is funded by ICED and in collaboration with our wonderful partners of the WinVC Collaborative, which Bamboo is going to describe a little bit later. Before we get into it, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that I live, work, and play in Toronto, now known as Toronto. In Mohawk, it means where there are trees standing in the water. Today, Toronto is covered under Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. It is the traditional territory of many First Peoples, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. As an organization focused on capital flows towards underfunded communities, New Power Labs commits to partnering and supporting Indigenous communities in our research, in our practices, and the way that we structure our partnerships. We know that there continues to be a disproportionate impact on Indigenous participation in Canada's economy as a result of our history. And there is a lot to do there, and we are only beginning to try to make a difference. Couple of housekeeping notes. We know that there are many of you joining us online today, and we'd love to meet you. And I know that a bunch of you have already started doing so. But if you could, it would be really helpful for us if you could introduce yourself in the chat. Second, this session is going to be recorded, so please take a note of that. After the session is concluded, we will post a recap of the event in English and in French alongside this recording. To turn on closed captions, please click the CC icon on the bottom of your screen. To see French captions, you just click the arrow next to the CC button and choose French as the option. In terms of the agenda, we have two big parts to this webinar. The first is a research share out in which my colleague Bamboo is going to share some learnings from the research that we've been conducting over the last couple of months. Followed by a fantastic panel discussion with two amazing speakers. And last thing before I introduce these set speakers, we will have a Q&A session at the end of our discussion. So feel free to submit any questions through the Q&A box as we go along, and vote for others' questions, and we will sort of curate and collect them as we go along. So on to the speakers. It is my great pleasure to introduce two fantastic individuals today, Allison Gibson and Sylvain Carle, for a conversation on how we can foster a more inclusive venture capital ecosystem for diverse, underfunded entrepreneurs. Start by acknowledging Allison, who's an entrepreneur and the Chief Design Officer at Spring Activator. She has a track record of creating impact-driven programs that leverage her entrepreneurial and investing experiences and providing consulting for purpose-led organizations. Allison is passionate about demystifying the world of venture capital and creating pathways to funding for women, BIPOC communities, and newcomers. In her spare time, you can find Allison volunteering in her community, supporting the development of food access programs, and she insisted I say this, napping on the couch with her 2 cats. And next, Sylvain Carle is the co-founder and director of Civic. He has long been dedicated to emerging technologies, combining curiosity, passion, intuition, and ambition. He has developed his expertise at the intersection of technology, innovation, investment, and people. And as an investor in innovation that transforms industries, sectors, and regions, he humbly aspires to a future where technology is sustainable, equitable, and humanized, contributing positively to society and the environment. And he also wanted me to note this as well. He also has a very large cat. Personally, I'm more of a dog person, but I'll let that slide because, these are, again, fantastic people. So to summarize, thank you so much for being, to all of you, for being with us today. Quick reminder for those who are listening, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and put any questions you may have for our speakers, as we go along. And I'll jump over, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Bamboo to give us a brief overview of the research work that we've done so far to provide a little bit of context for our subsequent conversation. Over to you, Bamboo.
Thank you, Tom, for the lovely introduction. Before we dig in, I wanted to highlight that this research is part of our responsibility as the partner in WIN-VC, a fantastic collective with partners across Canada. We're tackling issues related to gender diversity, gender-lens investing, and supporting women-led businesses. By gender-lens investing, we mean thinking through how gender shapes who makes investment decisions, how decisions are made, and ultimately who receives capital. There are 3 main questions we think are helpful from the MIT Lab. Who evaluates? Consider the roles and backgrounds of those involved in due diligence processes. What is evaluated? Review how gender considerations are integrated and evaluated among the criteria, screens, and rubrics used in the due diligence process. How is it evaluated? Review how your due diligence processes are designed, deployed, and monitored to deliver designed gender outcomes. Our position is that being mindful of these questions and issues can help unlock the potential of many underfunded groups. Now, the good news. Next slide, please. We see incredible opportunities for women and non-binary funders. A lot of research shows that women are more capital efficient. For example, privately held tech companies led by women achieve a remarkable 35% higher return on investment. Here in Canada, we are also seeing positive strides with policies and initiatives promoting women and non-binary participation in entrepreneurship. However, despite these bright spots, there's a crucial gap to address. Women and non-binary funders still face significant underinvestment, and we all know this. So, what's going on? Why is there such a gap? We'll crack open that question in the next slide and explore the reasons behind this underinvestment. A key reason we want to discuss today is the unconscious bias in the due diligence process. Unconscious bias refers to those learned stereotypes and assumptions we hold about people or groups, often without even realizing it. These biases can influence our decision-making, especially in areas like due diligence, the process where investors assess businesses before investing. For instance, unconscious bias can lead us to favor applicants who seem similar to ourselves, which can limit the diversity of teams and the range of ideas considered. Here's why this matters. Unconscious bias is a barrier to innovation and economic growth. When talented founders don't get a fair shot, everyone loses out on potentially groundbreaking ideas. Think about it. If great business miss out on funding because of unconscious bias, it creates an uneven playing field. Now you might be thinking, isn't there training to address unconscious bias? The answer is yes, but there's a catch. Diversity training programs often focus on raising awareness of bias, which is a good first step. However, research suggests these programs may not always lead to lasting changes in behavior. We need more comprehensive solutions to tackle systematic barriers. Let's dig deeper. Where does bias creep in? Let's take a look at the typical investment pipeline. Starting from screening and ending with evaluation, bias we've uncovered can occur at any stage of the pipeline. Our focus today is on due diligence. Let's explore some specific ways this bias can manifest and, more importantly, how we can address it. One key issue is that traditional views about differences between men and women founders can lead to underinvestment in women-led businesses. For example, unconscious stereotypes might portray women as less risk tolerant or less decisive leaders, which can influence investment decisions. These biases can also extend to gender diverse founders who may face even greater challenges due to a wider range of stereotypes. To illustrate this point, a UK study involving 118 LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs found that a significant portion, about 1/3, were hesitant to reveal their identity, fearing negative consequences. Nearly half of those surveyed weren't comfortable sharing their identity or believe it would harm their business prospects. So how can we create a more inclusive environment for all founders? Research suggests that focusing on objective due diligence process can be a first crucial step. First, the gender-blind due diligence process may be one way forward. Similarly, creating instruments like women-specific funds may eliminate some of this risk. Second, investors seem to discount people, both men, women, and non-binary founders, who display traditionally female behaviors, getting more women to be decision makers and founders, and training investors to understand these kinds of gaps. Another issue we want to address might revolve around information asymmetry. Investors often rely on their past experiences to understand the potential success of women and non-binary founders. But because there are fewer women and non-binary founders, this may lead them to be perceived as riskier, even if their ideas hold great promise. Let's break it down. Women and non-binary founders might not have a long history of starting businesses, or they may have fewer previous investors who can vouch for them. More importantly, investors may simply not have enough good experience dealing with women-led businesses to think they are a good bet. So how can we address this bias in risk assessment? Here are some alternative strategies to consider from our literature. First, investors can look beyond the immediate lack of a funding experience, consider relevant experience in startups, even if not as a founder. This can also highlight their skills and knowledge. Second, consider alternative ways to assess risk. Requesting references directly from funders instead of relying solely on established names can be a more inclusive approach. Finally, exploring co-investment opportunities with other partners can share the perceived risk and create a more attractive investment proposition for everyone involved. More generally, for entrepreneurs, getting out there and talk to more investors who are known to support underfunded demographics definitely helps. For investors, fostering connections and promoting education among them could help to create a more inclusive funding landscape. And this is exactly what our Win VC partners are doing in their entrepreneurship programs. So what are some key takeaways for people trying to shake up traditional venture capitals? Here are a couple. The first point is that bias is a systemic issue that requires deep buy-in to change. As the quote suggests, people just want to be judged on the value of their business propositions and merit, not on their gender. This is particularly important at the due diligence stage, but not unique to it. Bias is a complex issue that can creep into the investment processes at various stages. We need to create ways to assess the funder's ability to succeed objectively, but also acknowledge that doing that work is likely not enough. The second point is a more practical one. How can we change practices today? Investors must acknowledge that women-owned and non-binary owned businesses may look or may be perceived differently than those owned by men. We need to confront this and adjust to this, and we can not ignore it. At the same time, changing the due diligence process is likely to be hard and requires strong allies. And we hope to have some of them here today with us. Thank you again for joining us today. And this is just the beginning of the conversation. To delve deeper and explore more, we're thrilled to invite you to our panel discussion next. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks so much for that wonderful overview, Bamboo. As a heads up, sort of some of this work that we are sort of preparing is eventually going to find its way onto our website, and we'll be happy to share with folks in a more sort of systematic way once that is available for consumption. We'd love to move on to our conversation with our fantastic speakers. I'd love to start by inviting them to reflect on the importance of reaching underfunded communities through angel investments and venture capital. What motivates you to invest in these communities? Why is this important to you, and why it should be important to others, to Canada as a community? So maybe Allison, if you wouldn't mind sort of sharing some thoughts around these questions, that'd be super helpful.
Yeah, happy to. And it's such a great question because Bamboo shared some really great, ways to move the dial, things that we can do to make, I guess, the overall space more inclusive and just almost more welcoming. But what I'll say is actually, I'll give an example of I've always kind of been like intimidated by the world of VC. I didn't understand it. I didn't know all the things until I had to raise my first like round of raising, and I was going through the motions, and it was all the things. It was confusing. It was complicated. It was moving at the speed of light. It was also during the height of COVID. There was like zero empathy or compassion or even acknowledgement of the things that I didn't know, even though these investors really wanted to work with me. So fast forward to now, something that I've embraced and I'm really grateful for is that I've been welcomed into communities and spaces, particularly by angel investors. So I think that's something that's super important and that investors should start doing more. I myself am not an angel investor, but that was okay. I disclosed that and said I would like to learn, and I feel comfortable learning in this environment. And funny enough, it was a group of like 40 or 50 like older white men that were like, sure, come on in. And I was shocked, but I thought I'm not going to learn if, or, have access to these spaces if I don't ask. And they welcomed me with open arms. To this day, they do. They invite me to all of the things, all of the learning opportunities, all of the like chats on a yacht, all these experiences that I would never have access to. And when I ask them, why don't I see more people like me in their space? They simply say either A, like nobody asks, or B, they're just not really looking there. And so they already acknowledge that they are overlooking certain communities or people that they're curious about, but they themselves don't know where to start. So I just think having the conversation is super important so we can, on both sides, start to reach out, connect, and kind of mix and mingle more.
Yeah, thanks so much for that wonderful sort of answer, Allison. I think I love the idea of, how we collectively have to move the needle, right? So like we know that, I know that a bunch of it falls eventually, obviously, on entrepreneurs, but I think some investors for sure are willing to do the work, right? And it's about sort of like connecting both of these parties to, open up those spaces. Turn it over to Sylvain also to think about, again, reflecting on what the importance is of reaching underfunded communities to you, and how you've seen this sort of, how does it fit in your worldview of what these look like?
Yeah, it's kind of weird. It was weird for me to realize that fact about only like 4% of the women receiving investments. Because I always thought of venture capital as the people that would take risk and that would try different things and that would not go with, what was commonly a more conservative approach. But really, if you think about it, people from finance are not that innovative. They're risk averse, even if they're in venture capital. And so, as an entrepreneur myself, someone who has bootstrap and had to learn, never got invited on a yacht for a chat when I was an entrepreneur at first. I had to sort of like unpack and be really pragmatic about entrepreneurship and about funding and about building companies, and try to bring the same approach to investing. So I was an entrepreneur for 20 years. When I sort of like went to the other side of the table as an investor, really wanted to have an open approach to the community. And I was running a program called Founder Fuel in Montreal, and we were having these conversations within the team about the number of women that were applying to our program. And the first fact was that we have no number. Like, we have not been tracking these numbers. We have intuitively, we know that it's skewed, but we ran the number and it was pretty bad. And the only way to fix that was not to continue to do the same as as usual, but was to change something. And for me, that was the beginning of the process, is that if you want to change something, especially in finance, it helps to have numbers and have ambition towards those numbers. And so we started tracking these numbers, having panels, inviting women entrepreneurs. I realized that we never had like a woman-only panel, and it's like, well, let's do one. Let's kick off recruiting with this panel of 4 women who have been running their business, who have been through these kind of programs and funding processes, and it changed a lot, right? It was just a question of realizing the facts and starting tracking these numbers, and in a really pragmatic way, how can we get to parity? Because in my mind, and maybe this is because my mother was a feminist and my daughters and son will be feminist, and I'm myself, it was about equality and justice, right? And so it was not fair to not consider everyone for investment, especially in Canada, where most of the funds have money from foundations, from public sources, either at the provincial or federal level. So it seemed to me that we should be doing it better as Canadians, but we were not. And so I'll end up this like long intro to say, we know the work we have to do. We know that it's not being done and not progressing at the pace it has to be progressing. So we need to put more pressure for things to change.
Absolutely. To circle back on one of your original points, we'll have to ask Allison about that yacht invitation. But more generally, I think you're right. I think it feels quite surprising to think of, in the way that you framed it, right? VCs actually turns out very conservative, right? When it's supposed to be all about taking on risk.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to try to bring Allison into that conversation. Allison, do you have any initial thoughts around sort of, this, I don't know, weird dichotomy between sort of, VC actually being very conservative when it comes to women, but also sort of being willing to take, risks for others?
Yeah, it's a weird, I mean, that's what a dichotomy is. It's like kind of strange. And then when you say it out loud, or I actually think about it further, I'm like, why aren't investors willing to take that risk? Or to be fair, using my yacht example, why does it take me having to go into that space and assimilate and be like, yeah, I'll come on the yacht? Because obviously I want to go on the yacht. There was champagne. It was, yeah, I want to be there. Like, who does it? But at the same time, it's almost, there's so much frill, there's so much happening that for me, it takes away from what we're really trying to do. And that's like open up space, communication, share the learnings. And so while, again, I'm happy to go on the yacht, I actually would much prefer that the way I look at it is, if an investor is interested in something that I have, you almost kind of have to play on my turf a little bit, right? And I know we're getting into this a bit later, and we talk about like imbalance of power dynamics, but it's very much, I think that's why it's so intimidating, especially to women, is like, as a woman, I'm not super interested in stepping into a space where I already know I'm giving up pretty much all my power. I'm going to someone and asking them for their money. And especially if we're playing by their rules on their turf, it's just super like uncomfortable. And it just seems unnecessary, because I always hear investors say, I invest to make money. I invest for a return on my investment. Great. So if you see potential in me or any founder and what they've started, and you see the potential for a return and you're interested, I don't know why it has to be, I have to check all these little boxes just to even get to the conversation. I'm not suggesting that we don't follow like due diligence and do the things to vet a deal, like that all should happen. But I think before we get there, like the process up to getting there is it's just such a turnoff. Like it's, for me personally speaking, it has been a turnoff, and I've shied away from, I would say, other investment opportunities as an entrepreneur, because I just, to be quite frank, I just didn't want to deal with it. I didn't want to deal with the BS. I didn't want to deal with having to like code switch even more than I already code switch and put on a different face on top of the different face that I already put on. I don't have time for it. I really don't. And as much as I do want the money and I want access to the capital, I think other women get, and gender diverse people especially, get into this mind frame. It's like, how much of myself am I willing to give up, to put away, to like, how much of this dance am I actually willing to do to enter this space? Like, is it worth it? It's kind of like, I don't know if I answered your question, by the way, but yeah, that's what came to mind when I heard Sylvain talking.
No, that's totally, I mean, that's something I try to exactly what you said about on what turf is that game being played. That's so key. And I remember reaching out to the queer tech community in Montreal and saying, like, please invite me to your event. I want to come. And this is during Pride Week. It's perfect. Let me go to this event. I want to meet more people. I want to meet the gay angels, or called the Gangels. Let's meet with this tribe. They're from New York. They were visiting in Montreal, and it's you. So you have to make that effort, that conscious effort to reach out. And as an investor, the way I see it is that I have an edge. I'm meeting more people with more interesting ideas. I'll find investment opportunities that others won't find, and we'll show them together they were great investment opportunities, right? And because at the early stage, it's all about people. So we need to break these barriers, and we can. I think that's for me what is the most gives me most hope, is that I'm seeing these events, community open up, and they're more porous than ever before, and that's good news. But the numbers in terms of investments are not following along. So we need to be putting pressure. And I'll tell you a little secret: as investors, we have two customers. We have entrepreneurs. We're serving entrepreneurs, because investors without entrepreneurs, they don't have a business. But the other half of my business is getting people to invest in my fund. So you have to put pressure on the investors, they're called the limited partners, that are investing in the funds, and put out these rules. And we've had recent examples recently. The VCCI, the federal government, had a diverse funding stream where they had put really good requirements in terms of diversity and inclusion. The social finance fund is out there, is investing in funds and putting some interesting criteria. The BDC is doing the same thing. So I think this is where there's more pressure to be put on, because that's, and we say follow the money, right? So where does the money come from? Like, go back to the source. And in Canada, that's actually a big part of the funds that invest in entrepreneurs come from public sources or philanthropy or others. So that's one place where we could put more effort and more pressure.
Yeah, I love those 2 points, or this whole idea of sort of like getting investors on entrepreneurs' turf, right? And like creating those connections and creating those spaces. We know that who ends up evaluating, who ends up doing the due diligence, who ends up making the connections, who ends up scouting deals is really important for the success of entrepreneurs. And so if they're not willing to take those steps, right? And as Sylvain sort of showed, there are plenty of examples of people doing this work in Canada, right? If more people aren't doing this, then, we won't see the results that we need to see to, find some parity or equity in this space. I'd like to move into sort of thinking about from the perspective of entrepreneurs, perhaps. What do you think an entrepreneur from a diverse background, and we've sort of touched on some of these issues that are sort of perhaps hidden to others, but what are some issues that what should they know about getting into venture capital that is not obvious and might be surprising to somebody that's just starting out in this space? I'll start with Allison.
Sure. I would say, talking to myself 4 years ago, all money is not good money. Be aware of who you're considering doing a deal with. It may or may not be in your best interest to go into business with this person or these group of people. And I think the thing that I didn't take into consideration is that I'm taking someone's money, but that they now have say into the decisions I make, what happens with the business going forward. So please choose wisely. I also think that VC doesn't have to be complicated. Like I mentioned earlier, I was really intimidated by the space. I didn't understand it. I'm not a big numbers person in the sense of like math was never my strong forte. I have no idea how I don't know. And I just did it. I just did the math, but then I kept thinking numbers, like venture capital equals numbers, not understanding that it's not necessarily up to me, like as an entrepreneur, to crunch the numbers and make sure everything works. There's people to help with that. There's tools, there's templates, there's spreadsheets. You don't have to tackle it all by yourself, but I do suggest that you lean into like leveraging your transferable skills, because that really, really paid off for me. Do your research, there are training programs you can participate in. Essentially do your homework to get a lay of the land and understand what your strengths are versus your weaknesses, and wherever you may be weak, you don't have to tackle that by yourself. And then finally, I would say the due diligence process was way more challenging and complicated than I thought. It can be really lengthy. It may or may not be. It can be all the things or none of the things. So I would say my best advice to any like founders in that are considering getting into the space are making sure like your important documents are organized, up to date, whether that's a data room or whatever you want to call it. I think one thing I didn't realize was how much information, someone would need to vet me and review the company, where I had all these documents, right? Like all these random folders in places that maybe didn't matter to me or my team because we could find them. But then when I had to give them to somebody in an organized and like cohesive manner, I think the first day they asked me to, the first investment, when they asked to review documents, I don't think I slept. I think I actually spent like 24 straight hours just trying to get it together, and it was still crap. It wasn't good enough. It was like an ongoing battle. I always felt behind. Like I had to constantly just dedicate so much time to getting this information together. And I was like, girl, why weren't you organized in the first place? Because I'm typically really organized. So that was one area I just didn't realize you had to be organized in.
Yeah, thanks so much, Allison. I think the highlight there is that obviously this entire process is not easy. It's a challenge in the best of circumstances. So I wonder, Sylvain could jump in on this sort of conversation, sort of like what is uniquely difficult, or might you imagine might be uniquely difficult about getting money, right? When you're
Right.
from a background that hasn't usually received funding.
It's always hard. Just let's start there. Most founders will not be successful at raising money, so that bar is super high. When I started, and it was in the year 2005, 6, 7, first times I raised VC. It was still pretty unknown, and so there's a lot of information on the internet. But I always say the hardest things are not explained on the internet, right? You learn with peers, and so that's been my approach in developing community hubs like Naughman House in Montreal, so that entrepreneurs could meet and talk amongst themselves about the VCs, because the VCs talk amongst themselves about the entrepreneurs they meet, and just exchange and say, well, what's in your term sheet? What's this thing? What does this mean? And you have to negotiate everything, and so get the knowledge and the peer support going. And today there's many more programs out there, and I think incubators, accelerators are out there. There's programs specifically for women investors. I was seeing like She Boots recently was recruiting. I think they're changing their name, but these kinds of programs are really, really good in terms of having a cohort of peers, and you can compare notes and share, and just sometimes you have intuitively, you think something's wrong, but you're not sure. Like it's your first time. And so you can ask your friends and your peers, is this normal? And they'll tell you like, no, this is not normal. And by the way, if your gut is telling you no, listen to it. It knows something that your brain hasn't fully digested yet. But yes, I think this notion of community and of support is super important. And as we were mentioning, it is there is an imbalance of power between investors and founders, and maybe because I've been a founder for 2 decades, much longer than I've been an investor, I have a lot of empathy for founders. I think there's also a lot of support that you can get from investors that are not investing in your company. One of the best advice I got from a mentor was to say, to raise your first million, you need to meet 40 investors. Start with the ones you don't want money from, to learn and to practice and to get their objections, and then meet the partners, because we're talking about long-term partnership here. This is typically 5, 7, 9, 11 years when things go well. So take the time, but you need to meet 40. And not because you need to convince 40 people, but you need to find the people that are convinced that what you have is unique and special. And that changes the whole thing, because you're not stressing about, oh, if I miss this one, I'm done. No, no, no. If they don't understand what you're trying to do and you're explaining it really well because you've practiced and you're doing it in a well-structured way, well, they're not the right fit. And it's in a way, it's like finding a life partner for your personal life, but this is for your business life. Take the time to do it right. But it's tough. I mean, won't shy away from that.
Yeah, thanks so much for that sort of point to that. And I think linking some of the points you were talking about, sort of, yes, VCs are sharing information about entrepreneurs, right? How can we create resources for underfunded leaders to sort of also lean on each other, right? And specifically when I'm talking about like specific communities, like for example, women and non-binary peers, right? Where can they meet, right? And I know that there are some programs and accelerators that have, unique programs to support these communities, right? But that's not a given, right? And so I wonder, Allison, what kinds of communities exist out there for, these types of founders, and what might be challenging about their specific journey, I guess, that might help them, move forward together.
Such a good question, because I feel like the communities exist, but sometimes if you don't have access to them, just if you don't know, like you don't know, often the communities exist in silos. So there may be several people having the same conversation, but just separate. So what I've seen happening is like there's events like this where people are coming together, thought leadership, sharing knowledge and education. But I've seen a shift to maybe where, COVID, I don't want to say it's gone, but behind us. And now we're back to in-person, like in-person events are in full swing. So there's a lot more in-person gathering opportunities, which I like. I think, networking face-to-face is the best. And I'm seeing specific communities pop up that are like they're putting out there what the purpose of the community is. So it's not just come and network. It's like this community is for women or gender diverse women in tech who want to do X or whatever. So I always encourage people to look for something that resonates based off of how specific it is. Nothing wrong with going to general networking events, obviously, but if you're a woman in tech and you want to break into that field, whatever that means, find the other women in tech. And I'm also seeing like the for us, by us kind of model. So women in tech creating those spaces for other women in tech, which I love because it kind of removes a little bit of, I think it just makes it a little bit more approachable. And it's fine. We can actually come together as women. I'm referencing a specific event I went to recently where it was for women in tech. And it was great to be with other women and talk about things that women want to talk about. Yes, we talked about tech, investing, founders, all the things. But then we were talking about Beyonce's new album, and I love that. And I think through finding commonalities and just where we're more alike than we're different in these communities actually helps to spark the conversation and get you one step closer to, hey, let me make that soft or even like warm introduction to this person I know that may be able to help you as an investor, as a mentor, whatever it might be, as opposed to what I call like those forced, like almost like forced networking that happens like before or after, let's say, a conference. I despise those. I don't want to go up to anyone and be like, hi, my name's Allison and I'm looking for $10 million. Do you want to give it to me? Like, that's so uncomfortable. I recognize that it has to be done, but I think anywhere there is an opportunity for us just to be human and connect and vibe about all the things, whether it's investment related or not, is super important, because that's where the magic happens. Once we, like, the barriers are removed, we realize we have tons in common, then, we start to network and do all the things. So I always say, look for the communities that are specific to what you're looking for, or that are calling out or acknowledging, like, we've created this space for you.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love the idea of like these communities have to come together sort of organically, right? And there's a bunch of research that we've sort of looked into around sort of the success or effectiveness of these in-person gatherings, and a lot of the evidence isn't very convincing. Like, it doesn't seem like to move the needle, but I think it's because it touches on one of your earlier points, which is like when they're manufactured, they can't possibly be as successful as if they are more organic and where people actually make connections that are lasting, right? That make that introduction more likely to happen. And so I think perhaps a lot of some more work needs to be done around sort of like creating really curated spaces in which people can feel like they're free to be themselves and to talk about things perhaps beyond investments. So yeah, I love that. I'm going to try to move the conversation into sort of thinking a little bit more about specifics of investors, underfunded investors. In our research, one of the things that consistently trips investors up is the fact that diverse-led businesses sometimes look different, not always, obviously, but sometimes look different from the startups led by men. This is a broad question, but hopefully you can entertain me. What would need to be done internally among investors to truly see the value and potential benefits of these businesses? And so I'll start with Sylvain because he already sort of touched on this, but I wonder if there's any more specifics that we can pull out here.
Yeah, I think it helps to be upfront about it. It helps to be upfront about the fact that if you haven't historically invested in these communities, what needs to happen for this to change, right? And actually, this morning, I love this conversation. I was talking to a woman entrepreneur, a Black woman entrepreneur, and she asked me straight up, like, have you invested? Are you working with Black entrepreneurs? How many women founders are you advising? And those are the questions you need to ask. And if the answer is, I haven't, or I don't know, well, maybe the onus is on you, investor, to start the change. And so how can we create these opportunities? And that's been my role as an ally. So I was one of the few men that was invited on a committee called Elle Invest at Réseau Capital to act as an ally and to call out other men investors and tell them, guys, that's inappropriate, or don't ask these kind of questions, or that's not the way to behave. You have to be able to do that and call them out too, right? And call me out if I'm inappropriate in any way, if I'm unconscious bias myself, right? And so we sort of like need to force it, and that's where it might be a little bit uncomfortable. But once it's done and once you get the ball rolling, it gets better. So this is why, as I said, I'm hopeful. But we need to create the context, right? So like at Startup Fest this summer, there's the Black Entrepreneurship Prize, 100K. So I hope one day we don't need to have a special prize, but given the situation we're starting from, it's great that there's a part of these special prizes. And well, that's where I am in sort of like in my thought process right now. We need to do extra work to make it happen.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on a point you said about sort of like needing to force it, right? And to tie it back to a previous point of yours is sort of like who needs to force it, right? Because considering and acknowledging that there is a power imbalance, right?
Yeah.
Sort of, it's fine that an entrepreneur is pushing you on these things, and that's really cool to see, right? But perhaps it's most effective when it's your peers, right? It's other investors
Totally.
that are asking this question.
Yes.
And it's just a fascinating sort of a little story. Allison, do you want to comment on sort of any things that you see as that might trip up investors when they're looking at women-led ventures?
Yeah, I feel like when I look at this, I feel like it's a bit of like from a founder's point of view, like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't in this scenario, because on one hand, I hear investors saying that they want to support gender diverse and women founders, and they acknowledge that the potential for great returns and, access to unique businesses and opportunities are there. But the investors are often not willing to think outside the box. And in fact, I often find, will often find like fault with the founders operating differently or looking different than they're used to. But again, taking it back to who has access to like the privileged networking spaces and the programs and the mentoring. You can't expect a founder who has figured most of the things out on their own and haven't gone through all of these like nice little fluffy experiences. You can't expect their businesses to look like what you're used to, or a typical business that has had access to all the support and all the networks and all of the things from day one. So I think it's a great benefit to investors to almost create their own unique frameworks, their own rubrics, their criteria, whatever you're using to, assess the potential of a deal. create something that works for you to then look at these diverse businesses so you can start to compare apples to apples and not try to jam or like fit them into a box that they clearly don't fit in or that they don't need to be in. I think that's kind of the only thing that I see that can be done differently in terms of putting the onus on investors, is just to approach it a little bit differently. It's different audience, like different outcomes, everything's different. So you can't then not be different and operate the same way. It just like doesn't work.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think that's sort of, and I'm not sure that I'm entirely sold with this approach. And I think it's probably a temporary fix, but sort of the idea of like funds specifically for women, right, or for underfunded communities that you might sort of create sort of more a more apples to apples comparison,
Yeah.
right? It's not always
It's
true, right?
it's
Again,
it's a stepping stone. I think that's
Yeah.
not the end goal. It helps because it helps to directly have pools of funding that are available.
Exactly.
I think more generalist funds should publish their targets, should have on their websites the goals that they have or the commitments that they've taken with their LPs, and be accountable to that, right? We're seeing with impact funds, which is not the same thing, but similar. If you're not delivering social impact for your fund, you're not getting the full pay or the full returns or the full carry. So we could be having bonus structures if you hit your targets, but if you don't hit your targets, you shouldn't get your full compensation. And if you're getting public money or mostly public money for these goals, you should be held accountable and they should be published. In Quebec, Investissement Québec has started doing that. It's called Capital Femme. They were publishing the numbers, how many women partners, how many investments in women-led businesses. Can we have a common definition for what is a woman-led business so that we can all agree and outperform instead of underperform? I think these are important and easy steps, but they need to be taken, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I hear you sort of on being a stopgap, but there's all these kind of creative things that you're talking about that are really, really interesting and plausible. You mentioned earlier around sort of like, oh, follow the money, right? In this case, is like you're talking about sort of like following through with the money, right? Sort of like making
Exactly.
sure that we're tying sort of what we want to do to reach underfunded communities to particular sort of funding structures or sort of compensation structures. And it's really interesting. And I guess jumping off of that point, one last sort of question before we move on to the audience is I wonder if you could think of a single thing that would about the way that investors or VC capital firms do that they could change to reach more women and non-binary people, what would it be? And maybe it's something we've already discussed, or maybe it's something we haven't discussed, but what would be that one thing you would change? And I'll start with Allison.
Wow. I think for me, it's kind of dropping like all the pomp and circumstance. Like, I think that'd be a great place to start. Like, I don't like golf. I don't want to meet you on the golf course to discuss a deal.
Well,
Like
unless
being,
it's a yacht. If it's a yacht,
I mean, I like the yachts. Being invited to a yacht is fun, completely unnecessary, right? It's not accessible by most. It like literally is not needed. In fact, I think as a founder, you should meet me on my turf since you want access to what I have. The expectation is on these diverse founders all the time for literally everything in life. And that's an experience that unless you are diverse, like you're a woman, you're non-binary, you have no idea what that's like. It's an insane burden. And I don't necessarily think that needs to extend to the world of VC. And like the expectation is there that diverse founders like have to hunt for investors. This is true. We have to go out and look for the money, but I rarely see investors interacting in the spaces and communities that they claim to want to support or that they want to gain access to. And this goes back to that power imbalance, right? Like, I don't think it's a huge drastic change that needs to be made for like deal terms or like the actual mechanics of closing a deal. Other than just like considering the obligations and just like where these diverse founders are, where they're coming from, things that they have, which may result in them needing more time or more support to negotiate and close a deal, but they don't need more champagne or like golf trips. Like they just need you to be actually invested. And if you really want access to that community, then go to that community.
Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
totally. Yeah.
for that?
I think the first currency that we control is time. And I would say as an investor, just do the inventory. How much time are you spending in the communities? Do you have advisors from these communities on your advisory committee, on your helping you organize an event, helping you decide to which event you should go, to what school, to what neighborhood, and being starting with your time is an easy thing to do because you control most of it, not always, but often. And so you can start there. And if you're not improving your time commitment, you're not going to improve your dollars committed, right? It's for me, it's a direct relationship, and that's something you can control. And I would start there, and I would say then give yourself a challenge, like amongst the investors, like who's going to invest the most in the underserved communities this year in Canada. There should be a prize at CVCA for that. There should be recognition for those that are doing the right thing.
Yeah, I love that that last point. It reminds me there's all this research around sort of how do you get surgeons to meet their targets of how many people they operate on in a given week. And it turns out that one of the most effective ways to make them change their behavior is to compare them to each other, to send them a little message about this is how you're doing on this metric compared to this other surgeon that works there. And so it maybe it's not about sort of celebrating investors, but just putting them in touch with data that they can see how they're doing, right? To spur more sort of that competition, because at the end of the day, it's sort of like that's what sort of VC is a little bit, right? And so yeah, so maybe one interesting way to think about it. I'm going to we have 5 minutes left, but we have a couple questions, and so I'm gonna ask one or two of them, and then we'll wrap up. So there's a question here. What specific ways can mentorship help underfunded entrepreneurs that may not be currently addressed? And I'm assuming this is, well, for both of you, it would be helpful, but I'll start with Allison. So what specific ways can mentorship help underfunded entrepreneurs? What's specific, I guess, about mentorship that might be helpful?
I've found it helpful for myself and when providing mentorship to start with the knowledge sharing. So identifying what they need, what they like, where they're at, what they may not know is great, but then sharing knowledge that comes from the world of VC. So like the latest article that everyone's talking about, or a framework, or or something to keep them in the loop, so that they're developing the language, the skills, their understanding, like they're kind of hip to what's going on, as opposed to treating them like, okay, you're this precious little thing that doesn't understand anything. I'm going to baby and coddle you. I don't think they need that. I actually enjoy kind of just throwing them into the fire and being like, welcome, here it is. And then giving them the information to learn, but then on the flip side, supporting them with where the knowledge gaps exist. So I find a lot of funders don't understand the jargon, the acronyms, it's the language, and they don't understand how to articulate what they're trying to say in that VC language. They know what they're doing, they know what they want to do, they know their goals, they just don't say it the way that I guess investors are used to hearing. So for me, I think it's closing the knowledge gap, it's sharing the lingo, the language. That could be articles. There's so many great blogs and podcasts. There's really cool ways to catch up. And I think that's way more helpful than I don't know, some of the homework activities I see that are just I don't know, I'm a founder, I don't have time for homework. If it's not related to my business, I don't think you should be asking people to do extra work. So just try to keep it super relevant and keep them in the loop of what's going on in the world of VC.
Love it. And I have one last question, so I'll have Sylvain take it. This is from the audience as well. I'd love to hear more about how women in non-binary led businesses sometimes look different, right? And they're making the person who's asking this question is, acknowledging that businesses in the fashion, food, arts, et cetera, tend to be women and non-binary led, right? How can we change the perception that these sort of sectors are less investable, right? Can we?
Well, we can in some ways, right? So I think one answer to a question that was asked earlier about what do you don't know about what should you learn about investment in VCs? You should learn about their business model. You should learn about how they make money and their incentives. And that's a talk I often give to entrepreneurs to help them understand why I ask them, can your business be worth $100 million in 5 to 7 years? What do I mean by that? Why do I ask that question? But that put aside, that's still knowledge, as Allison was sharing, understanding and knowledge. But I think what's most important is that the market doesn't lie. So as an investor, I'm a generalist, right? I don't understand every market I'm in, but I understand when a company is moving forward and when people have a product and they find product market fit, and a lot of people want this product that your company is providing. And so that speaks volume, right? So I would say if you have to optimize one thing as an entrepreneur is find your product market fit, get people to buy your product. That's your most important asset. Maybe you don't even need VC money if you get money from customers. That's the best source of money for a business. But if you have customers and if you're growing and people want what you have, VCs will be interested if you can show how this can grow. And so that's the other thing, where you've been, where you're at, where you're going. I want to understand where you're going. And please, please, please put out your most optimistic plan. I want to see that. I want to see your realist plan because we're managing money, but I want to see your ambition and your most optimistic plan. Show me your dreams. And this is what I would love to invest in.
Love it. Yeah, be aggressive. So thanks so much to both for sort of this lovely conversation. A few takeaways from the chat. Maybe we'll curate this later, but these are some things that struck me. The first one is around sort of venture capital living up to its reputation around taking risks, right? We need to put pressure on funders, to limited partners perhaps, to remove barriers so that we can fund diverse entrepreneurs. The second one is around sort of entrepreneurs themselves, right? Thinking about how to create space so they can break out of silos and share knowledge and insights with each other in ways that are productive, right? And perhaps not always as structured or as planned as others might have in mind. And then the third point is around this thing I call, following through with the money. It's sort of like finding ways in which we can put, challenges or structures that can help incentivize funders to do things differently. And Sylvain pointed to some things that are happening at the government level, but I think we can be more ambitious, right? And we can create new structures and hold ourselves accountable to a higher standard. So anyways, thank you to our audience for your support and commitment to move capital flows more equitably. And thanks specifically to Allison, Sylvain, and our folks at NPL behind the scenes, Bamboo and Han, for their hard work on setting up this webinar. And of course to our funders, ISED, and our partners at Win VC. Thank you so much. And hope you'll join us for the next one. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.